Before we begin, this story contains descriptions of a maritime disaster and the deaths of between 30 and 50 men. If that's something you need to step away from, we understand. Take care of yourself first. This episode's narration is AI-generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. August 10th, 1628. Stockholm Harbour. Thousands of people had lined the waterfront, foreign ambassadors, Swedish nobles, ordinary citizens pressing forward for a view of the most powerful warship their kingdom had ever built. Admiral Claes Fleming stood on the dock and watched the VAH cast off her lines. He wasn't cheering. He already knew what was going to happen. The VAH carried 64 bronze cannons arranged across 2 full gun decks. 700 carved figures covered her painted stern. She was the finest expression of Swedish military ambition the Baltic had ever seen. She was supposed to sail to war. She made it 1,300 meters before she sank. You're listening to the Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Today, a royal warship built to terrify the enemies of a king sinks in harbour in full sight of the city without firing a single shot. And the man who could have stopped it chose not to say a word. The year is 1625. Sweden is a rising Baltic power, and King Gustav II Adolf wants a flagship that says so. He orders a new royal warship, his largest, with something no Swedish ship has ever attempted. 2 full decks of cannons, one stacked above the other. The commission goes to Hendrik H.E. Bertsson, a Dutch master shipbuilder working in Stockholm. Bertsson is experienced enough to know the 2-deck design will push the ship's center of gravity dangerously high. He builds it anyway. The king has asked. You build what the king asks. Construction begins at the Royal Shipyard in 1626. The VAH takes shape over 2 years, 226 feet long, with a painted gallery stern that rises 4 stories above the waterline, bright red and gold at the carved sections, black below the gunwales. 64 bronze cannons are hauled aboard, each weighing nearly a ton. 700 carved sculptures are fitted to the hull, open-mouthed lion figureheads at the hawse holes, Roman emperors in relief along the galleries, demonic faces above the lower gun ports with their mouths painted red. The VAH isn't just a warship. She's a floating political statement. Sweden is telling every other power in the Baltic, look at what we've made. But while the sculpture work is going up on the outside, a quieter problem is taking shape in the hull's geometry. The lower gun ports, the row of openings on the bottom deck, where the heaviest cannons sit, are only 3 feet above the waterline when the ship is loaded. In calm harbour waters, that's fine. On a heeling ship in a wind, that gap becomes a flood valve. The king is on campaign in Poland. He sends letters pressing for launch updates. The pressure travels down the chain. Nobody pushes back. Then Bertsson dies, the lead builder, the one man who holds the full picture of what has been built and what it demands, dies of illness in 1627 before the ship is finished. His junior partner, Arent de Groot, takes over. He doesn't pause construction. He doesn't raise concerns. He sees a ship nearly complete and a king who wants it launched. The VAH in the water must have been extraordinary to see. The gilded carvings alone took years of work. On a clear Stockholm morning, with the light off the harbour, she would have looked like something out of a myth. Stockholm had never built anything like her. Neither had anyone else. Sweden's greatest warship was about to become Sweden's most expensive wreck, and at least one person on the dock that August afternoon already knew it. August 10th, 1628. A Sunday, warm with a light breeze off the water. The harbour is packed, the launch of the flagship, and nobody who can see it wants to miss it. The VAH is towed out from her dock. 4 sails catch the breeze. She begins to move across the harbour toward the open strait. The crowd cheers. Officers on the deck take their positions. The cannons are loaded for a salute. Then the first gust hits. The VAH heels to port, leans hard to the left, and recovers. The crowd cheers louder. That's what warships do. They heel and they come back. Then the second gust hits. This time the VAH SAR heels further, and this time she doesn't come back. Water begins to pour through the lower gun ports in a roaring sheet. The bronze cannons on the lower port deck slide and crash. Men on the upper deck grab for the rails. The stern slides under, then the bow. The top of the mainmast drops below the surface. Eyewitnesses described a terrible sucking sound as she disappeared. The water around the spot churned white. 13 minutes. That's how long the VAH SAR was under sail. Between 30 and 50 men drowned. The ship carried her crew and her cannon and her sealed barrels of provisions straight down to the bottom of Stockholm harbour in 32 meters of cold Baltic water. The crowd watched. The admirals watched. The ambassadors watched. And then they started asking the question that nobody in authority was going to answer honestly. How? Stockholm in 1628 had no way to retrieve a ship from 32 meters down. No salvage technology existed for a wreck this size. The city absorbed the shock quietly. The king, still on campaign in Poland, received the news by letter. The question wasn't what went wrong. The physics of that were plain enough. The question was who knew, and when, and why no one had said anything. 18 months before the sinking. Early 1627, morning at the Royal Shipyard, the VAH SAR is still at the fitting-out dock. Scaffolding runs along the upper works. The planking of the upper gun deck is new enough to still smell of sawdust. A flat expanse, roughly 130 feet long, 40 feet wide. Admiral Class Fleming orders a stability test. Standard practice, before a new hull carries men to sea, you want to know how she moves. The method is simple. He calls 30 soldiers to the upper deck and tells them to run together, from port rail to starboard rail, back and forth, in unison. The test begins. The soldiers run. The VAH SAR sways. After the third pass, the mast tips so far from vertical that men grab the rail to keep their footing. Fleming raises his hand. The test stops. By the standards of the day, a ship should absorb the movement of 30 men on her deck without alarming anyone. The VAH SAR couldn't manage 3 passes. Fleming writes no report. He tells no superior. He doesn't alert the builders. He doesn't write to the king. He returns to his offices. Later, after the ship is on the bottom, Fleming will explain himself at the inquiry. The king had approved the ship's dimensions. Who was he to question the king? But Fleming is an admiral. Questioning a ship that can't handle 30 men on its deck is precisely his job. He saw the mast tip. He halted the test himself. He knew. When historians try to reconstruct what actually sank the VAH SAR, they find no shortage of candidates, and they don't cancel each other out. The explanation the 1628 inquiry treated as given, the design itself. 2 full gun decks stacked one above the other raised the center of gravity too high. According to the VAH SAR Museum's consensus, she was top-heavy by construction, and there may have been no conditions under which she'd have survived a serious wind on that hull. Then there's the open gun ports. Naval historians have noted that opening the lower ports during a harbour transit was standard Swedish naval practice at the time. Nobody aboard made an error by doing it. The VAH SAR's problem was geometry. Once she heeled, those openings were 3 feet above the water. The ports didn't sink her. The design made the ports fatal. And then there's the pressure from the crown. The VAH SAR was redesigned multiple times mid-construction as the king demanded modifications. The ship's proportions were already set when those changes were folded in. According to the VAH SAR Museum's historical interpretation, the pressure to launch on schedule meant no one ever had the chance, or the courage, to stop and recalculate from the beginning. All 3 explanations fit the evidence, which means the VAH SAR had multiple ways to fail, and she only needed one of them to work. September 1628. A formal royal inquiry convenes in Stockholm. The King's Privy Council is seated. Officers and builders are called one by one. The council asks the only question that matters: who is responsible for this disaster? Captain S.U.H. Fring Hansen, the ship's captain who survived the sinking, points to the pilot, and to the wind, and, for good measure, to God. The pilot says the builders made a ship the Baltic couldn't tolerate. The builder's men say they followed the Admiral's specifications exactly. Admiral Fleming says the king himself approved the ship's dimensions. Who was he to question the king? Nobody's name can be written on a charge, the court can't go higher than the king, and the king can't be accused. The inquiry closes with no finding. No charges, no punishment for anyone. The formal record fills pages of careful cursive on vellum, held today at the RIKS Arkivet, the Swedish National Archives, and arrives at nothing. The transcripts contain no drawings of the VAH SAR. The builders never made written plans. They worked from chalk marks, memory, and tradition. The knowledge of what the ship actually was lived in the hands of the men who built her. And those men weren't talking. 333 years later, divers would find something inside the hull that changed the question entirely. April 24, 1961, Stockholm Harbour, television cameras on the dock. A marine engineer named Anders Franzén had spent 15 years searching for the VAH SAR. He'd located her in 1956, lying on the harbour floor nearly intact, preserved by cold Baltic water, too brackish for the wood-boring shipworm, too cold for the bacteria that would have dissolved the hull over centuries. She'd been sitting down there, waiting, since 1628. The raising takes years of careful preparation. When the VAH SAR finally breaks the surface in April of 1961, archaeologists begin cataloguing everything inside. They find sailors' sea chests holding coins, combs, and personal letters in Swedish, Dutch, and German. They find sealed barrels of butter and pork from the 1628 ship's stores. They find the skeletons of 15 to 25 men, adult crew members, most in their 20s and 30s, and they find 25 measuring rulers. Half are calibrated in Swedish feet, 12 inches to the foot, half in Amsterdam feet, 11 inches to the foot. 2 construction teams had been building opposite sides of the VAH SAR. For the entire length of construction, they'd been working in incompatible units. Nobody ever compared their rulers. The accumulated error across the full width of the hull made the starboard side 11 inches wider than the port side. The ship's center of buoyancy was shifted before her keel was finished. The asymmetry was built in from the first plank. The 1628 inquiry never found it because the builders kept no written plans and the court never measured the wreck. This detail wasn't uncovered by the salvage divers who recovered the cannons in 1664. It wasn't found in the years immediately after the 1961 raising. It emerged from careful archaeological measurement published by VAH SAR Museum lead archaeologist Fred Hocker in 2011, nearly 400 years after the ship went down. The Admiral's silence was real, and it may not have changed anything. The VAH SAR could have been unsaleable before Fleming ever ran his secret test. Here's what the VAH SAR leaves us with. The silence narrative is true. Class Fleming knew the ship was unstable. Every officer in that chain calculated that the cost of telling the king was higher than the cost of saying nothing. That calculation helped send 30 to 50 men to the bottom of Stockholm Harbour. And then the rulers arrive and reframe it. The ship may have been doomed by the time Fleming ran his test. The institutional silence enabled a catastrophe that the silence alone may not have caused. Both things hold at once. Catastrophe doesn't always need a single villain. Sometimes it needs only an institution that doesn't check its assumptions, and a chain of command that makes honesty more dangerous than silence. The VAH SAR had both. The ship spent 333 years in the cold dark of the Baltic, holding every clue inside her hull, the rulers, the tools, the barrels, the bones. The truth was always down there. It just had to be lifted. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend who can't sleep. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.